Part 1. The sun had barely started its descent when Jason Reed stepped out of the local deli, the weight of another busy day still hanging on his shoulders. A light breeze stirred the air, but it wasn't enough to cool the heat radiating from the cracked pavement. He adjusted his dark polo, feeling the itch of the polyester against his skin, and glanced at the small coffee cup in his hand. A deep sigh escaped him. It had been a long day. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. Jason took a slow, deliberate step toward the crosswalk. The city was alive, bustling with pedestrians weaving in and out of traffic, bikes cutting through the chaos, and the hum of everyday life continuing without pause. He was just another man in the crowd, walking, blending in, until he wasn't. A sharp screech of tires broke the calm, followed by the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights. For a brief moment, everything else seemed to fall away, the noise of the city, the voices, the people. All that remained was the feeling that something was wrong. Jason slowed, instinctively feeling the tension creep into his muscles. He knew it before it even happened. There was something in the air, the kind of tension that made his chest tighten and his stomach churn. He didn't need to look back to know it was him. The officer in the squad car had spotted him. Jason didn't know why, didn't know what was coming. But deep down, he could feel it. This wasn't going to be like any other stop. He kept walking, but his steps were slower now, measured. His hand instinctively gripped the handle of his coffee a little tighter. He could feel the heat of the officer's gaze on him, even though he couldn't see it yet. He wasn't scared, no, that wasn't the word. But he was aware. Aware of the way the world sometimes looked at him, the way people assumed things before they even spoke to him. He was black, and in a city like this, that alone was a reason to be stopped, to be questioned. To be scrutinized. He reached the corner of the intersection, and the squad car pulled up beside him, the engine humming low as it came to a halt. The officer rolled down the window, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "Hey, you," the officer called out. His voice was authoritative, sharp, but there was something else in it, something that spoke of assumption. Jason turned his head slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. The officer was a young man, probably in his late 20s, with short cropped hair and a look of determination on his face. There was something familiar about the way he looked at Jason, but Jason couldn't quite place it. "Yeah?" Jason asked, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. "I need you to step over here, please." The officer's hand was already on the door handle, ready to swing it open. Jason didn't flinch. "Is there a reason?" Jason asked, his tone still steady, but now the weight of the question lingered in the air. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave Jason a quick once-over, eyes flicking from his shoes to his face, then back down again. It was the kind of look Jason had grown all too familiar with, the kind of look that said he didn't belong, that he was out of place. "Just step over here," the officer said again, his tone a little firmer this time. Jason hesitated, then nodded and moved toward the curb. His steps were slow, deliberate. He wasn't afraid, but he was aware. Always aware. The officer got out of the car, moving quickly, his boots clapping against the pavement. Jason couldn't help but notice the way the officer's hand hovered just above his gun, as if waiting for something. The officer looked up at him, and for a brief moment, Jason thought he saw something that wasn't quite fear but was close to it. Something that told him this wasn't just about a routine stop. But Jason didn't have time to dwell on it. "Do you know why I stopped you?" the officer asked, his voice edged with impatience. Jason raised an eyebrow. "No, I don't. I was just crossing the street." The officer didn't respond at first. Instead, he looked Jason up and down again, his eyes lingering on Jason's face for a moment longer than necessary. Jason could feel it, the discomfort in the air, the tension rising with every passing second. This wasn't about traffic. This wasn't about crossing a street. This was something else. "Can I see your ID?" the officer asked, pulling a notepad from his pocket. Jason's fingers brushed the edge of his wallet, and he hesitated for a split second. It wasn't fear. No. It was a moment of clarity. He could feel the officer sizing him up, trying to make assumptions based on his appearance alone. He could sense the judgment in the air, heavy and thick. Jason exhaled slowly, then pulled out his ID and handed it over. The officer glanced at it briefly, scanning the name. Jason Reed. The officer's brow furrowed, and for the first time, Jason saw something shift in his face, something that looked like recognition. "Wait," the officer said, his voice trailing off. He looked at the ID again, his eyes widening slightly. "Reed? Jason Reed? Are you?" Jason's stomach turned, but he kept his face neutral. "Yeah," he said slowly, letting the silence hang between them. "That's me." The officer looked at him for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to find the right words. Jason knew exactly what he was thinking. He could see it in the officer's eyes, the realization dawning on him. Jason was more than just another man in the city. Jason Reed was the head of internal affairs. The officer didn't know it yet, but that meant Jason had the power to investigate every single one of his actions, every misstep, every decision. It meant Jason could tear apart his career with just a single phone call. The officer stammered, his grip on the ID tightening. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to. I just thought." Jason tilted his head slightly, studying the officer's reaction. He wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. This was the moment, the one that could go either way. "You thought what?" Jason asked, his voice now sharp, cutting through the officer's flustered apology. "You thought I didn't belong here. You thought I was a threat because of how I looked. Because of where I was walking." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find an answer. Jason's eyes narrowed, and he could feel his pulse quicken. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something much deeper. The officer stepped back, his gaze shifting nervously. He didn't know how to handle this. He had expected something entirely different, maybe a confrontation, maybe a fight. But not this. Not a black man standing in front of him, with the power to dismantle everything he knew. Jason stood tall, his gaze unwavering. This wasn't just about the officer anymore. This was about all the times he had been judged without a second thought, about all the assumptions made about him simply because of his skin. About every moment he had been forced to prove himself when no one else had to. This moment would change everything. For both of them. If you enjoyed this start, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue telling stories that challenge our understanding of the world. Jason could feel the air between him and the officer thickening, like a sudden gust of wind that caught everyone off guard. The silence stretched long enough to make his bones ache. The officer's body language was a mixture of discomfort and unease, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle that was far too complex for him to solve. Jason's hands remained at his sides, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight, waiting for the next move. "Look, I didn't mean any harm," the officer said, his voice faltering. His eyes kept darting back to Jason's ID, as though it were some kind of verification that didn't quite match the image he had in his mind. "I was just doing my job, you know." Jason's lips parted slightly, but the words didn't come immediately. His chest tightened with the effort to keep his voice steady. "Doing your job," he repeated, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you were doing? Or were you doing your job as you saw it, based on assumptions you've made about me because of how I look?" The officer looked up, his face reddening as he stammered. No, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean to. I wasn't profiling you." Jason took a step forward, closing the gap between them. The officer instinctively stepped back, his hand once again hovering near his belt. Jason could see the unease crawling up the officer's spine, but it wasn't fear that gripped him, it was uncertainty. Uncertainty about how to respond to the unexpected twist that Jason had presented. He had expected the usual, a confrontation, maybe a moment of resistance. But this wasn't about that. Not at all. This was about understanding, about the deep currents of prejudice and bias that ran beneath the surface. "You didn't mean to," Jason said, his voice low but steady. "But you did, didn't you? You saw me, you saw a black man standing here, and you thought you had to question me. You thought I wasn't supposed to be in this neighborhood. And you were ready to treat me like I was less than, based on nothing but your assumptions." The officer's face tightened as the words hit him. "I didn't mean it like that. I'm just trying to do my job. I didn't know who you were, I swear." His words rushed out in a desperate attempt to justify himself, but Jason could see through it. He could see the cracks forming in the officer's defense, the cracks that had been there all along, buried beneath his uniform. Jason's eyes narrowed. He wasn't sure if the officer truly understood the weight of his words, but it didn't matter. He wasn't about to let this moment pass without making the officer face the truth. "No," Jason said firmly, his voice carrying an edge that made the officer flinch. "You didn't know who I was. But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't bother to know me, to find out who I really am. You saw the color of my skin, you saw a black man in an unfamiliar neighborhood, and you assumed I was guilty of something. And that assumption could have ruined my life." The officer's face shifted. He was starting to understand, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Jason could see the battle waging in his mind, the battle between the pride that came with his uniform and the uncomfortable truth that had just been shoved into his face. Jason took a deep breath and stepped back, putting some distance between them. "I'm not angry with you," he said, his voice calmer now. "I'm angry with a system that made you feel like this was okay. A system that taught you to see me as a threat before you ever bothered to learn who I am. And that system didn't just fail me, it failed you, too." The officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was frozen, caught in a moment where his own reality was crumbling around him. He had spent his career upholding laws, believing in fairness, believing in justice. But now, standing in front of Jason Reed, the walls of that belief were beginning to crack. Jason's gaze softened just slightly. "You were taught to believe that people like me are always the ones who need to be watched. But I'm not a criminal. And you know what? I'm not the one who needs to be watched, either." The officer's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. His eyes lowered to the ground, and Jason saw him for the first time as just another man, just another person struggling to reconcile what he had been taught with what he now knew to be true. Jason knew the officer wasn't going to get it all at once. This wasn't something that could be understood in a few moments of awkward silence. But there was hope in the air now, a flicker of something that could change if the officer allowed it to. "What's your name?" Jason asked, his voice gentler now, as if they were having a normal conversation instead of standing in the middle of a tense, life-altering encounter. The officer blinked, taken aback by the question. He hadn't expected it. Ryan. Officer Ryan Brooks." Jason nodded, as if considering the name. "Ryan," he said, as though testing it on his tongue. "You're not a bad guy, Ryan. But you need to start asking yourself why you act the way you do. Start questioning the system that raised you to look at me and see a threat instead of a human being." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the pavement. Jason took one last look at him before turning to leave, his footsteps measured and slow. He didn't need to say anything else. He didn't need to convince Ryan. He had already done what he came to do. The rest was up to the officer, and Jason hoped, deep down, that the words would stick. If you're feeling the impact of this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Every bit of support helps bring these vital conversations to light. Stay tuned for more of Jason's story, because change begins with us all. Jason's footsteps echoed as he walked away from Officer Ryan Brooks, but the sound seemed distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The air around him felt heavy, thick with unspoken truths, but the weight of it was different now. He wasn't walking away from the officer's judgment anymore. He wasn't walking away from the world's assumptions. He was walking towards something else. Something larger. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that Ryan was still standing there, staring at the spot where he had just been, his mind likely whirling in 1,000 different directions. Jason knew the officer would go back to his patrol car eventually, maybe even radio in to his partner or supervisor. But Jason didn't care. This wasn't about the officer anymore. This was about the space between them. That brief moment of clarity, of transformation, was something far more significant than the traffic stop ever could have been. As Jason walked down the street, the familiar hum of the city filled his ears again, but this time, it felt different. He was acutely aware of everything around him, the chatter of people, the rush of cars speeding past, the distant wail of a siren. The world, once just a blur of routine, was now alive with meaning, and it didn't feel as safe as it used to. Not anymore. He passed a small park where children ran and played under the watchful eyes of their parents. The sight made his chest tighten, the innocence of it all like a cruel reminder of what could be lost. Jason's mind drifted to his own childhood, to the times he had tried to forget. He had been that kid, running, laughing, without a care in the world, until the world showed him just how different he was. He remembered the first time he had been stopped by an officer. He was barely 12, just a boy walking home from school, when a cop pulled up alongside him, demanded his ID, and asked him where he was going. At the time, he didn't understand why. He had been just another kid, no different from any other, but it wasn't until later that he realized the truth. He was black. And in that moment, in the officer's eyes, that was all that mattered. Jason stopped walking and stood still for a moment, letting the memories wash over him. It felt as if the city had paused, holding its breath with him. His fingers clenched around his coffee cup, the warmth of it grounding him in the present. The officer had made assumptions about him, assumptions that were hard to shake. And Jason had spent the rest of his life fighting those assumptions. Fighting to prove that he wasn't what people thought he was. The weight of that fight, of the expectations others placed on him, settled heavily on his shoulders. But the encounter with Ryan had shifted something inside him. He didn't know what it was yet. Maybe it was the officer's genuine remorse, or maybe it was the power he held, the knowledge that he had the authority to change things. Either way, something had clicked. He started walking again, this time with purpose, as if the entire city had just shifted beneath his feet. He crossed the street to a small cafe on the corner and pushed open the door, the soft chime of the bell signaling his arrival. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods immediately filled his senses, a brief moment of comfort in the chaos of the day. He ordered his usual, a black coffee, and sat at a window table, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the officer and the weight of their conversation. As he sipped his coffee, Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, the name on the screen making his pulse quicken, Director Harris. He answered immediately, pressing the phone to his ear. Jason, Harris's voice came through, sharp but warm. I need you in the office. There's something I need to discuss with you. Something urgent. Jason's stomach tightened. What's going on? We'll talk when you get here. It's about the department. I don't want to say too much over the phone. Just get here. Jason glanced at the time on his phone. He had just finished his coffee, but this conversation wasn't going to wait. He quickly paid for his drink, tossed the change in the tip jar, and stepped out of the cafe. His mind was already racing with possibilities, but none of them felt good. Something was wrong. Something that needed his attention immediately. As he made his way to his car, the world seemed to close in around him. The streets felt narrower, more oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something bigger than just his encounter with Ryan. It wasn't until he reached the office, a sleek building in the heart of the city, that the weight of it all began to sink in. Jason entered the building, nodded at the security guard who greeted him, and took the elevator to the top floor, where the Internal Affairs office was located. The elevator chimed as it reached his floor, and Jason stepped out, the sharp click of his shoes on the tile floor echoing in the hallway. He turned the corner and saw Harris standing outside his office. Harris was tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude, but today, there was something different in his posture. His arms were crossed, his brow furrowed, and his lips were pressed into a tight line. Jason approached him slowly, his senses alert. "What's going on, Director?" Harris didn't waste any time. "There's been a breach. Someone in the department has been leaking information. Confidential cases. High-level investigations. The kind of stuff we've been working on for months." Jason's stomach dropped. "How do you know?" "We found the trail," Harris said, his voice low. "It's leading back to someone in the department. Someone we trust. I need your help, Jason. I need you to look into it. To dig deeper." Jason's heart began to race as his mind whirred. The stakes had just gotten much higher. His position had always been about accountability, but now it seemed like the very integrity of the department was in question. Someone he worked with, someone he trusted, was leaking information. And that meant everything Jason had worked for, everything he stood for, was under threat. "Who?" Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. He had to know. He had to understand who he was working with, and why they were doing this. Harris's eyes flickered toward the closed door of his office. "I can't say yet. But I'll have you briefed on the details. You need to get to the bottom of this, Jason. We can't let this continue." Jason nodded, his mind spinning. The officer on the street, the betrayal within his own ranks, was it all connected? Had Ryan's assumptions about him been a symptom of something much deeper, something far more systemic than just a bad traffic stop? "I'll get on it right away," Jason said, turning to head into Harris's office. But as he walked past the door, he froze. A thought, a question, nagged at the back of his mind. How far did this go? How deep did the corruption run? If you're feeling the tension rise in this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps the conversation going and helps bring these important issues to the forefront. Stay tuned for more twists and revelations.